October 14, 1884, the cellar of Halloway Lodge in Millbrook, Ohio. Sheriff Ezra Caldwell stands frozen, his oil lamp trembling in his hand as the light reveals what lies beneath the dirt floor. 7 shallow graves, 7 sets of bones arranged in deliberate patterns, and on the wall above them, scratched into the limestone with what appears to be human fingernails, a single phrase repeated over and over: "They came to me impure." The woman responsible sits upstairs in her parlor, hands folded. In her lap, saying nothing, Constance Halloway, respected widow, church member, and proprietor of the town's most reputable boarding house. For 6 years, travelers had arrived at her door seeking lodging. Some of them never left. Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Take a moment and tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Are you alone? There's something about sharing these dark moments together that makes them easier to bear. We're building a community here, and your voice matters. Now, let's step back to 1884, to a time when Millbrook, Ohio, was nothing more than a collection of modest houses clustered along a single muddy road, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. Halloway Lodge stood at the edge of town, a 3-story structure of weathered clapboard and dark windows that caught the last rays of evening sun like dead eyes. It had been built in 1878 by Constance and her late husband, Edmund Halloway, who died under mysterious circumstances in the winter of 1879. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but Dr. Horace Merrick, who examined the body, noted in his private journal that Edmund's face bore an expression of absolute terror, as if he had seen something no mortal should witness. After Edmund's death, Constance continued operating the boarding house alone. She was 47 years old, thin as a willow switch, with grey hair always pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, according to those who knew her, were peculiar. One witness described them as colourless, like water in a glass, reflecting nothing back. The lodge catered to travelling salesmen, itinerant workers, and occasional families passing through on their way to larger cities. Rates were reasonable, meals were included, the rooms were clean, but there was something unsettling about the place that most visitors couldn't quite articulate, a heaviness in the air. The way sounds seemed muffled, as if the house itself absorbed them. The peculiar smell that permeated the upper floors, which Constance explained away as old wood and damp. By October 1884, Sheriff Ezra Caldwell had received 3 missing person reports in as many months. First was a traveling Bible salesman named Martin Jessup, last seen entering Halloway Lodge on July 8th. Then a young couple, the Rutherfords, who had checked in on August 12th and were expected in Cleveland by the 15th, but never arrived. Finally, Irving Pemberton, a fabric merchant from Columbus, who vanished without a trace on September 29th. Pemberton's disappearance triggered the investigation that would unravel everything. His brother, a prominent attorney, pressured state authorities to take action. On October 14th, Sheriff Caldwell arrived at Halloway Lodge with a search warrant and 2 deputies. What they found in that cellar would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But the graves were only the beginning, because when they searched Constance's private quarters on the 3rd floor, they discovered something far more disturbing than the bodies themselves. A diary, bound in black leather, filled with meticulous entries dating back to 1879, written in Constance's careful, slanting hand. And the first entry began with 5 words that made Sheriff Caldwell's blood run cold. Edmund understands now. He saw it. What had Edmund seen? What had driven Constance Halloway to transform her boarding house into a tomb? And most disturbing of all, if 7 bodies were found in that cellar, how many more guests had checked into Halloway Lodge and simply vanished into the Ohio night? The answers would prove more terrifying than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. To understand what happened at Halloway Lodge, we must first understand the world that created it. The year 1884 existed in a peculiar moment in American history, caught between the trauma of the Civil War and the rapid industrialization that would define the coming century. Millbrook, Ohio, was a town that progress had largely forgotten. Situated in the southeastern corner of the state, far from the railroad lines that were stitching the nation together, it remained isolated, insular, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. The population in 1884 numbered approximately 300 souls, most of them farmers, tradesmen, or workers at the small lumber mill that operated along Blackwater Creek. The town had been founded in 1821 by settlers from Pennsylvania, many of them followers of various Protestant denominations that emphasized strict moral codes and the constant vigilance against sin. By the 1880s, this religious fervor had evolved into something darker, more obsessive. The Reverend Ambrose Tyndale, who had led Millbrook's only church since 1867, preached sermons focused almost exclusively on damnation, corruption of the soul, and the hidden evil that lurked in human hearts. His influence cannot be overstated. In a town without newspapers, without theaters, without any real connection to the outside world, Reverend Tyndale's Sunday sermons were the primary source of moral guidance and entertainment. According to surviving transcripts of his sermons, archived in the Millbrook Historical Society, Tyndale was obsessed with the concept of spiritual contamination that he believed travelers carried with them from the sinful cities of the East. They come bearing disease of the soul, he wrote in an 1882 sermon. They sleep in our houses, eat at our tables, and leave behind invisible corruption that seeps into our very walls. We must be vigilant. We must be pure. Constance Halloway never missed a Sunday service. She had arrived in Millbrook in 1876 with her husband Edmund, both of them refugees from a scandal in Pittsburgh that was never fully explained in official records. What is known comes from a brief mention in the Pittsburgh Gazette from March 1876, reporting that Edmund Halloway, a clerk at a shipping company, had been dismissed under circumstances related to irregularities in accounting and other moral failings. The article is maddeningly vague, but it was enough to drive the couple westward, seeking anonymity in a town that asked few questions. They purchased the property that would become Halloway Lodge, with money Edmund claimed to have inherited from a deceased uncle. The building had previously served as a way station for stagecoaches, but by 1876 had fallen into disrepair. Edmund and Constance renovated it themselves, working through the brutal winter of 1876-1877, transforming it into a respectable boarding house. Neighbors recalled that Edmund was affable, quick to smile, perhaps too quick. He drank moderately but regularly at the town's single tavern. Constance, by contrast, was reserved to the point of coldness. She spoke only when necessary. She never socialized beyond church attendance. Several women in town attempted to befriend her but found her unreceptive, almost hostile to intimacy. "She looked at you like you were meat going bad," one neighbor, Mrs. Judith Crenshaw, later testified. Not with disgust exactly, more like she was calculating how long before you spoiled completely. Edmund died on February 3, 1879. The circumstances, as mentioned, were suspicious but not investigated. Dr. Horace Merrick was the only physician within 20 miles, and he was an elderly man more interested in his whiskey than in asking uncomfortable questions. He signed the death certificate without performing a thorough examination. Constance buried Edmund in the small cemetery behind Millbrook Church. She wore black for exactly 1 month, then resumed wearing ordinary dresses. When questioned about her abbreviated mourning period, she simply said, "Edmund is where he needs to be." The boarding house continued operating without interruption. Constance managed everything herself, including the cooking, cleaning and maintenance of the three-story structure. She employed no servants, accepted no help. Guests checked in at the small desk in the front hall, paid in advance, and were given keys to their rooms. Breakfast was served at 7, supper at 6, no exceptions. The first disappearance that can be definitively linked to Halloway Lodge occurred in May 1879, just 3 months after Edmund's death. A surveyor named Thomas Wickham had checked in on May 7th, intending to stay 3 nights while mapping property boundaries for a land dispute. His employer in Columbus received no further communication. When inquiries were made, Constance claimed Wickham had checked out on May 9th, leaving no forwarding address. No one thought much of it. Traveling men were unreliable. They drank, they gambled, they sometimes decided to simply start over somewhere new. It wasn't until the pattern repeated that questions began to emerge. But even then, even as more guests vanished, Millbrook's isolation worked in Constance's favor. There was no police force beyond Sheriff Caldwell, who covered 3 counties and was often weeks away from the town. There was no telegraph office. Communication with the outside world moved at the speed of mail coaches, which arrived twice weekly when weather permitted. Constance existed in a perfect void of accountability. She attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, singing hymns in a voice witnesses, described as surprisingly beautiful, almost hypnotic. She donated regularly to the church fund. She baked bread for sick neighbors. She was, by all external appearances, a model Christian woman maintaining a respectable business in difficult circumstances. Only Reverend Tyndale seemed to sense something beneath the surface. In a letter to a colleague in Cincinnati, dated September 1883 and discovered years later, he wrote, "There is a woman in my congregation who troubles me greatly. She listens to my sermons with an intensity that borders on fanaticism, yet I feel she hears something entirely different from what I intend. It is as if she takes my warnings about corruption and transforms them into something darker, more active. I fear she may be implementing her own interpretations." He never confronted her directly. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he sensed that Constance Halloway had moved beyond the reach of ordinary pastoral guidance. By the autumn of 1884, at least 12 people had vanished after checking into Halloway Lodge. Only 7 bodies would be found in the cellar. The others remain unaccounted for to this day. Irving Pemberton arrived in Millbrook on the afternoon of September 27, 1884. He was a fabric merchant from Columbus, 38 years old, married with 2 young daughters. His route took him through the small towns of southeastern Ohio, selling bolts of cloth to general stores and taking orders for specialty fabrics. He was meticulous in his habits. Every evening, he wrote letters to his wife, Sarah, detailing his day's activities, his sales, and his planned route for the following day. These letters, preserved in court records, provide a chilling timeline of his final days. September 27th. Arrived Millbrook 3 p.m., lodging at a place called Halloway Lodge. Clean enough, though the proprietress is a strange, silent woman. The house has an odd atmosphere, but I've stayed in worse. We'll visit the general store tomorrow. September 28th. Only one other guest here presently, a traveling salesman named Voss. Decent fellow, though he seems nervous about something. The proprietress served a fine supper, beef stew, but I notice she watches us eat with an intensity that I find unsettling. Voss barely touched his food. September 29th. No letter was written. Sarah Pemberton expected her husband home by October 3rd. When he failed to arrive, she waited 2 additional days before contacting his brother, attorney Marcus Pemberton, who immediately contacted authorities in Ohio. Sheriff Ezra Caldwell was 52 years old, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen his share of death and human cruelty. But he was also lazy, comfortable in his position, and disinclined to investigate situations that required effort. When Marcus Pemberton's urgent telegram arrived, demanding a search for his missing brother, Caldwell's first instinct was to dismiss it. "Traveling men go missing all the time," he told his deputy, William Marsh. "Probably met a woman or lost his money gambling. He'll turn up." But Marcus Pemberton was not a man easily dismissed. He arrived in Millbrook personally on October 11th, accompanied by 2 private investigators from Columbus. He carried his brother's letters, including the final one mentioning Halloway Lodge. He demanded action. Reluctantly, Sheriff Caldwell agreed to visit the boarding house and ask some questions. He arrived on the morning of October 12th, alone, not yet convinced this was anything more than a waste of his time. Constance answered the door, her face expressionless. "I'm looking for a man named Irving Pemberton," Caldwell said. "His family says he was staying here." "He checked out on the 30th of September, Constance replied, her voice flat, emotionless. "Paid his bill and left. I don't know where he went." "Did he say anything about his plans? Where he was heading?" "No." "Did anyone see him leave?" "I don't keep track of my guests' movements, Sheriff. This is a lodging house, not a prison." There was something in her tone, a subtle defiance that made Caldwell pause. He looked past her into the dim hallway. The house was silent, oppressively so. "Mind if I look around?" "I do mind, actually, unless you have legal authority." She was within her rights. Caldwell had no warrant, no probable cause. He left, frustrated, but now genuinely curious. Something about Constance Halloway's complete lack of concern bothered him. He began making inquiries around, in town. Had anyone seen Irving Pemberton leave Halloway Lodge? Had anyone seen him at all after September 28th? No one had. More disturbing, when Caldwell began asking about other missing travelers, a pattern emerged. Over the past 5 years, at least a dozen people had been reported missing after last being seen in Millbrook, and nearly all of them had stayed at Halloway Lodge. One witness provided particularly disturbing testimony. Nathaniel Voss, the traveling salesman mentioned in Pemberton's letter, was located at a boarding house in Zanesville. When questioned, he became visibly agitated. "I left that place in the middle of the night," Voss told Caldwell. "Something was wrong there, deeply wrong." "What do you mean?" "The sounds. At night you could hear things in the walls, movement, and sometimes voices, muffled, like people trying to scream through cloth." "Did you report this?" "To who? I was just passing through. I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then, that last night, September 28th, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, dragging, and I heard Pemberton's door open. I heard him say something, surprised, like he recognized whoever was there. Then silence. In the morning, his door was locked from the outside. His key was gone. I asked Mrs. Halloway about it, and she said he'd checked out early, but his wagon was still behind the house. His samples were still in his room. I could see them through the window." "Why didn't you stay and investigate?" Voss looked ashamed. "I was scared, Sheriff, scared out of my mind. I paid my bill and left before breakfast. I'm not proud of it." Armed with this testimony and growing pressure from Marcus Pemberton, Caldwell obtained a search warrant on October 13th. He gathered 2 deputies and returned to Halloway Lodge the following morning. Constance answered the door as before, showing no surprise, no concern. "We have a warrant to search the premises," Caldwell announced. "Then search," she replied, stepping aside. They started in the guest rooms. Everything appeared normal. Clean beds, modest furnishings. But in Irving Pemberton's former room, they found something that made Caldwell's stomach tighten. Hidden beneath the mattress was Pemberton's sample case, still filled with fabric samples. His personal effects were in the wardrobe. His traveling coat hung on a hook. "You said he checked out," Caldwell said. Constance stood in the doorway, expressionless. He must have forgotten them. All of his belongings? His business samples? She said nothing. It was Deputy Marsh who noticed the smell. A sickly, sweet odor, faint but distinct, seeming to rise from the floorboards themselves. He followed it to the kitchen, then down a narrow staircase to the cellar. The cellar door was locked. Constance claimed not to have the key. Caldwell broke it open with an axe. The stairs descended into absolute darkness. Caldwell lit his oil lamp and went down first. The smell grew stronger. His lamp illuminated rough stone walls, dirt floors, storage shelves lined with preserving jars. And then, at the far end of the cellar, he saw the disturbed earth. Tell us in the comments what you think they found down there. Was this the work of one woman, or was there something more sinister at play? Don't just watch, be part of the investigation. Your theories matter. 7 graves, 7 shallow graves, some of the bodies barely decomposed, others reduced to bone. They were arranged in a specific pattern, forming a rough circle, and in the center of that circle, planted in the dirt like a grotesque monument, was a wooden post. Carved into its surface were names, 7 names. The last name carved was Irving Pemberton. Dr. Horace Merrick was summoned immediately, though at 71 years old, and with hands that trembled from decades of alcohol dependency, he was hardly the ideal medical examiner. He descended into that cellar, took one look at what lay in the dirt, and vomited into his handkerchief. The exhumation took 3 days. Each body was carefully removed, photographed with the crude equipment available in 1884, and examined. The state sent a more competent physician, Dr. Leonard Ashford from Columbus, to assist with the post-mortem analysis. The bodies were in varying states of decomposition, but enough remained to determine several horrifying facts. All 7 victims showed signs of having been poisoned. Dr. Ashford identified traces of arsenic in the tissue samples, though the dosages varied. Some victims appeared to have died quickly, others showed evidence of prolonged suffering. 3 of the bodies had broken bones, suggesting they had been alive when buried, thrashing in their shallow graves as the dirt was shoveled over them. But the most disturbing discovery came from examining the victims' mouths. In each skull, the jaw had been forcibly wired shut with thin copper wire. This had been done post-mortem in some cases, but in at least 3 instances, the wiring showed evidence of having been applied while the victims still lived. They had been silenced permanently. The identified victims were Martin Jessup, 43, Bible salesman, disappeared, July 1884. Catherine and James Rutherford, 26 and 28, married couple, disappeared August 1884. Irving Pemberton, 38, fabric merchant, disappeared September 1884. 3 unidentified remains, estimated to have been buried between 1879 and 1882. The 3 unidentified bodies posed their own mysteries. One was a young woman, approximately 20 years old, buried with what appeared to be a small wooden cross clutched in her skeletal hands. Another was a man of about 50, whose skull showed evidence of severe trauma predating death. The third was the most disturbing. The skeleton of what Dr. Ashford determined was a boy no older than 16. Why had a child been staying at a boarding house alone? Had he been traveling with adults who were also killed, their bodies disposed of elsewhere? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. While the exhumation proceeded, Sheriff Caldwell conducted a thorough search of Constance's private quarters on the 3rd floor of Halloway Lodge. What he found there would provide a window into a mind so disturbed, so completely detached from moral reality, that it defied comprehension. The room was Spartan: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small writing desk, a wardrobe containing 4 identical black dresses. No mirrors, no decorations, no personal effects beyond a few books, all religious texts with certain passages heavily underlined. The diary was in a locked drawer of the desk. Caldwell broke the lock and found the black leather-bound volume, its pages filled with Constance's meticulous handwriting. The entries spanned from February 1879, days after Edmund's death, to September 1884, just weeks before her arrest. The first entry explained everything and nothing. February 5th, 1879. Edmund understands now. He saw it. In the walls, in the foundations, in the very bones of this house. The corruption that Reverend Tyndale warned us about is not metaphorical. It is real. It is tangible. It can be seen by those pure enough to perceive it. Edmund saw it, and it destroyed him. His heart couldn't bear the knowledge, but I am stronger. I see it too, and I know what must be done. The entries continued in this vein, describing an increasingly elaborate delusion. Constance believed that travelers carried spiritual contamination that infected buildings and communities. She believed that Reverend Tyndale's sermons were direct messages from God, instructing her specifically to purify these contaminated souls before they could spread their corruption further. May 10th, 1879. The surveyor Wickham was particularly infected. I could see the darkness emanating from him like smoke. He spoke of cities, of theatres, of dancing. He carried the contamination of worldly pleasure. I offered him tea with the medicine. He accepted gratefully. He suspected nothing. By evening he could no longer stand. I helped him to the cellar, told him he was ill, that he needed rest. He believed me. They always believe me. I sealed his mouth as instructed and waited. 3 days. It takes 3 days for the purification to complete. When it was done, his spirit was clean. I buried him in the circle and marked his name. The diary described each murder in clinical detail. The selection of victims was not random. Constance had specific criteria. She targeted people who spoke too loudly, who dressed too colorfully, who mentioned attending theaters or drinking in taverns. She saw these as signs of spiritual corruption requiring her intervention. The most chilling entries concerned the Rutherfords, the young married couple. Constance had been particularly disturbed by their obvious affection for each other. August 15th, 1884. The Rutherfords disgust me. They touch constantly, holding hands, whispering to each other. Their passion is an affront to purity. They must be purified together. I put the medicine in their evening tea. They died holding each other, which was perhaps merciful, though they did not deserve mercy. But there were entries that suggested something beyond simple delusion, references to the voice in the walls that guided her. Descriptions of shadow figures that appeared in her room at night, instructing her on proper purification techniques. Mentions of the others who came before and the purpose built into the foundations. One entry from November 1881 was particularly disturbing. I found Edmund's final journal today hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He knew, before he died, he knew what this house was built upon. He wrote that he had discovered records from the previous owners, dating back to 1821. This land was used for something before the way station was built, something dark. Edmund believed the corruption was not being brought by travelers, but was already here in the ground, and that it was calling to them, drawing them here to be consumed. He tried to warn me, but the words he wrote make no sense. He wrote, "The house feeds." What does that mean? Buildings do not eat, they do not hunger, and yet, sometimes, in the deepest night, I hear sounds from the walls that sound almost like swallowing. The investigation expanded to locate other former guests of Halloway Lodge who had survived their stays. Their testimonies painted a picture of a house that seemed designed to trap and disorient. Eleanor Pritchard, the 34-year-old schoolteacher mentioned earlier, had stayed at Halloway Lodge for 2 nights in June 1884. Her written statement, preserved in court records, described experiences that several other witnesses corroborated. The rooms were clean but profoundly uncomfortable. The bed was too soft in some places and too hard in others, making restful sleep impossible. The windows, though they appeared normal, seemed to show the outside world at a strange angle, as if the house itself was slightly tilted. I heard sounds constantly, footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing, whispered conversations that stopped the moment I tried to listen closely. On my second night, I woke to find my door, which I had locked, standing open. Mrs. Halloway stood in the hallway, just standing there, watching me sleep. When I gasped, she said, "I was checking if you needed anything," and left. I departed the next morning without breakfast. Another witness, a railroad surveyor named Marcus Trent, described an even more disturbing encounter. I stayed there in March of '84. One night, I woke to use the chamber pot and saw light coming from beneath my door. I opened it and saw Mrs. Halloway in the hallway on her knees, with her ear pressed against the wall. She was listening to something. When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me with eyes that reflected the lamplight like an animal's, and she said, "They're still hungry." I asked who was hungry. She said, "The foundations." I left at first light and never went back. Most disturbing was the testimony of a child, 12-year-old Sarah Wickham, daughter of the surveyor Thomas Wickham, who had disappeared in 1879. She had accompanied her father on that trip, but had stayed with a family friend in town rather than at the lodge. She testified that on the night before her father vanished, she had snuck out to visit him at Halloway Lodge. What she saw haunted her for decades. I went to the window of his room and tapped on it. Papa came to the window and opened it. He looked scared. He told me I shouldn't be there, that the house was wrong, that he was leaving in the morning, and I should tell Mrs. Brennan, the family friend, to keep me away. Then he looked over his shoulder into the room, and his face went white. He whispered, "She's coming," and shut the window. I hid in the bushes. A few minutes later, I saw Mrs. Halloway enter Papa's room with a tea tray. Through the window, I watched him drink. Within an hour, he was on the floor. She dragged him out of the room. I was too frightened to scream. I ran back to Mrs. Brennan's house and said nothing. I've hated myself for my silence every day since. The testimonies established a pattern. Constance selected her victims carefully, targeting those who stayed alone, who had no one expecting them locally, whose disappearance would cause minimal immediate concern. She used arsenic dissolved in tea or evening wine, offering it as a gesture of hospitality. Once the victims were incapacitated, she moved them to the cellar, where the final horrific acts occurred. But why wire their mouths shut? Dr. Ashford had a theory, based on his examination of the bodies and reading of the diary. Mrs. Halloway believed she was performing a religious function, a purification ritual. The wiring of the jaws served 2 purposes. Practically, it prevented screaming that might alert other guests or neighbors, but symbolically, I believe, she saw it as sealing in the corruption, preventing the contaminated spirit from escaping into the air. She was, in her diseased mind, performing an act of service to her community. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Constance had been taking money and valuables from her victims. Martin Jessop's gold pocket watch was found in her room, Catherine Rutherford's wedding ring, Irving Pemberton's wallet still, containing $47, but the amounts were relatively small, suggesting that material gain was not the primary motive. The money and items seemed to be kept as trophies, tokens of successful purifications. One item found in Constance's room defied explanation, a small wooden box containing human teeth, 17 teeth, each labeled with a name and date. 7 of the names matched the victims in the cellar. The other 10 names were unknown, suggesting that the 7 bodies discovered represented only a fraction of Halloway Lodge's victims. Where were the other 10 bodies? This question would haunt investigators for decades. The trial of Constance Halloway began on January 15, 1885, in the county courthouse in MacArthur, Ohio. It lasted 3 days. She never spoke a word in her own defense, maintaining absolute silence throughout the proceedings. Her attorney, a public defender named Harold Weiss, who had been assigned to the case, could extract nothing from her. No explanation, no plea for mercy, no expression of remorse. The evidence was overwhelming. The bodies, the diary, the testimonies, the stolen belongings. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 7 counts of murder. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. Constance showed no reaction. She was led from the courtroom in shackles, her face expressionless, her colorless eyes staring straight ahead. One journalist present at the trial wrote, "It was like watching a mannequin being removed from a store window. There was no humanity visible in her at all." She was transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus to await execution. During her incarceration, she refused all visitors except Reverend Tyndale, who came once at her request. He later refused to discuss what they talked about, saying only, "I believe I saw evil in its purest form that day. May God have mercy on her soul, for I cannot." On August 3, 1885, before her scheduled execution, Constance Halloway was found dead in her cell. She had fashioned a noose from strips of her prison dress and hanged herself. A single note was found, clutched in her hand, written in her characteristic, precise script. "The work is not finished. The house still stands. Others will hear it calling." Halloway Lodge was seized by the state and sold at auction in September 1885. A farmer named Joel Pritchard purchased it for a remarkably low price, intending to convert it into a family home. His family moved in on October 1st. They lasted 11 days. Mrs. Helen Pritchard's testimony to local authorities: "The sounds were constant, movement in the walls, voices at night. Our youngest daughter, Emma, age 6, began speaking to the lady in black, who appeared in her room. Our oldest son refused to sleep on the 3rd floor, claiming he could hear digging sounds beneath his bed. On the 11th night, we woke to find all the interior doors in the house standing open, and on the zay wall of the hallway, written in what appeared to be ash, were the words, 'Not pure.' We left before dawn and never returned." The house stood empty for 3 years. In 1888, it burned to the ground in a fire of undetermined origin. No one bothered to rebuild. The property reverted to wilderness, and within a generation, the forest had reclaimed it entirely. But the story didn't end with the fire. In June 1952, a historian named Dr. Raymond Fletcher was researching obscure criminal cases in Ohio for a book he was writing on 19th century American crime. He traveled to Millbrook, which by then had grown into a modest town of about 800 residents, to examine county records related to the Halloway case. In the archives, he found a metal box that had been mislabeled and filed incorrectly. Inside were documents that had never been introduced as evidence at the trial, including a series of letters between Constance Halloway and an unknown correspondent, dated from 1880 to 1883. The letters were disturbing. They discussed the work in vague but suggestive terms. The correspondent, who signed only with the initial M, seemed to be providing guidance on proper purification techniques. One letter, dated March 1881, read, "Dear C, I am pleased your progress continues. The number 7 is significant, as you know. The circle must be maintained. When the 7th is placed, the foundation will be satisfied, and the house will sleep for a time. But remember, the hunger returns. In cycles, you must be prepared to begin again when called." Who was M? The handwriting analysis suggested a male writer, educated, possibly a clergyman or academic. Despite Dr. Fletcher's best efforts, the identity of Constance's correspondent was never established. More disturbing, Dr. Fletcher discovered that Halloway Lodge had not been the first boarding house on that property. County records showed that a previous structure, called Millbrook Station, had operated there from 1821 to 1854. It had also been a lodging house for travellers, and according to fragmentary records, at least 6 people had disappeared after staying there. In 1854, the owner of Millbrook Station, a man named Jeremiah Blackwell, possibly a relative of Reverend Ambrose Tyndale, whose original surname before marriage was also Blackwell, had been found dead in the building's cellar under circumstances described only as mysterious and disturbing. The building was torn down shortly afterward. When Edmund and Constance Halloway purchased the land in 1876, did they know its history? Edmund's journal, the one Constance mentioned in her diary, was never found. But the suggestion that he had discovered something about the land, something that ultimately led to his death, raises unsettling questions. Dr. Fletcher's research revealed one final disturbing detail. In the months following the fire that destroyed Halloway Lodge in 1888, several Millbrook residents reported seeing a woman matching Constance's description walking through the woods near the property's former location. These sightings were dismissed as hysteria or misidentification, but they persisted for years. As recently as 1979, a local teenager named Michael Voss, possibly a descendant of Nathaniel Voss, the traveling salesman who had escaped the lodge, reported encountering a thin woman in old-fashioned black clothing standing among the trees where Halloway Lodge once stood. He claimed she stared at him with eyes like water, before vanishing when he approached. The land remains undeveloped to this day. In the 1960s, a developer attempted to build a housing subdivision on the property, but abandoned the project after workers reported feeling overwhelming dread and experiencing vivid nightmares. Heavy equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. 3 workers quit, citing an evil presence. The most recent investigation of the site occurred in 2003, when a team from a local university's archaeology department received permission to survey the area using ground-penetrating radar, searching for any remaining evidence of the original structures. They found anomalies, multiple anomalies, suggesting the presence of additional mass graves, far more extensive than the 7 bodies discovered in 1884. The University Ethics Board shut down the excavation before it could proceed. The official reason given was preservation of historical site integrity. Unofficially, according to one team member who spoke anonymously to a local newspaper, the radar images showed something disturbing beneath the foundations. Not just bodies, but what appeared to be architectural features, chambers, tunnels, structures that predated even the 1821 establishment of Millbrook Station. What lies beneath that ground? What was the land used for before recorded history? And was Constance Halloway a murderer operating alone? Or was she, as her cryptic note suggested, merely continuing work that others had begun long before? To this day, the truth about what happened at Halloway Lodge remains elusive, obscured by time, lost evidence, and questions that may never be answered. 3 theories have emerged among historians, criminologists, and paranormal researchers who have studied the case. Theory 1, psychiatric delusion. The conventional explanation is that Constance Halloway suffered from a severe form of religious psychosis, exacerbated by social isolation, the trauma of her husband's death, and the influence of Reverend Tyndale's extreme sermons. In this view, she was a serial killer motivated by delusional beliefs about spiritual contamination. The mysterious correspondent, M, might have been a figment of her imagination, the letters fabricated to provide herself with validation for her actions. The earlier disappearances at Millbrook Station were coincidental, and the reported sightings after her death were mass hysteria or misidentification. This theory is favored by most academic historians. Theory 2. Occult conspiracy. A more disturbing possibility is that Constance was part of a larger network of individuals practicing some form of ritual murder under the guise of religious purification. The letters from M were real, suggesting coordination with others. The pattern of disappearances spanning multiple decades and multiple structures on the same land suggests an organized, long-term operation. Perhaps there were others like Constance, operating boarding houses and inns across rural America, selecting victims according to specific criteria, conducting their purifications according to shared protocols. If this theory is correct, the 7 bodies found in 1884 represent only a small fraction of the total victims, and Constance's death by suicide was not remorse, but a ritual conclusion to her role in a larger design. This theory is supported by some researchers who have identified similar patterns of disappearances at rural lodging houses throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia during the same period. Theory 3. Something in the land. The most unsettling theory, and the least scientifically respectable, is that there was something genuinely wrong with the land itself. The archaeological evidence of structures predating European settlement, the consistent reports of psychological disturbance experienced by anyone who spent time on the property, the pattern of violence spanning nearly a century, all suggest the possibility of some environmental or psychological factor rooted in the location. Was it contaminated ground, an indigenous burial site with genuine spiritual significance, or something more metaphysical, what some researchers call geopathic stress, locations where human beings seem prone to violence and madness? In this theory, Constance Halloway was less a perpetrator than a victim, her mind infected by whatever malevolent influence permeated that ground. Edmund saw it and died from the revelation. Constance saw it and became its instrument, and perhaps it still waits there, in the woods that have reclaimed the land, calling to anyone sensitive enough to hear. Which theory do you believe? Was Constance Halloway a madwoman acting alone, part of an occult conspiracy, or a puppet of something far stranger? More importantly, could it happen again? Are there other places like Halloway Lodge, standing quietly in isolated towns, running respectable businesses, hiding horrors beneath ordinary facades? The final, disturbing coda to this story comes from a document discovered in 2018. A graduate student researching property records in Ohio found a deed transfer for land in Millbrook. The transaction occurred in 2015. The property containing the former site of Halloway Lodge was sold to a private buyer. The buyer's name is listed as M. Halloway. The similarity to Halloway could be coincidental. The initial M matching the mysterious correspondent could be chance. But according to local residents, construction has begun on the property, a large structure. The permits describe it as a boutique hotel and historical site. No one in Millbrook seems particularly concerned. After all, the events of 1884 are ancient history. The town needs economic development. Tourism could be good for local businesses, and perhaps there is nothing to worry about. Perhaps the land is just land, the past is just the past, and the new hotel will operate without incident. But if you ever find yourself traveling through southeastern Ohio, and you come across a newly opened lodging house in a small town called Millbrook, you might want to keep driving, just to be safe. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey into America's past. If you found this story as disturbing and fascinating as I did, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're building a community here, a community of people who aren't afraid to look into the darkest corners of history and ask the uncomfortable questions. Leave a comment below with your theory about what really happened at Halloway Lodge. Was Constance insane, evil, or possessed? And would you stay at a hotel built on that land, knowing its history? Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that might be true. Welcome to our haunted community.